I guess.
Shall I?
Yeah, and Shigeto will introduce Laura. Yeah.
My pleasure. So Laura has obtained her PhD from UCLA in 2014, and she is now associate professor in linguistics at Dartmouth College. Her career is very impressive. She has already published 2 books, one on the grammar of Tomoso and one on Seunghun. She's also a recipient of NSF early career grant, which is very, very competitive. And she has also recently taken on an associate editorship of phonological data and analysis, I believe. And personally, my intellectual interaction with Laura is through my reading of her paper that she published in Phonology with Bruce Hayes about accent analysis of vowel harmony in Tomoso. And I learned really a lot from reading that paper. And today we are going to hear from Laura about grammatical tone and its segmental correlates.
Thank you so much, Shigeto, for that nice introduction. And I'm sorry to have disappointed in not talking about accent today. Seunghun won out on the talking about grammatical tone. So a little bit of sort of contextualization for this talk. You know, grammatical tone is something that I've worked on for a number of years since grad school, and I'm going to be teaching a seminar in the spring on non-concatenative morphology more generally. And so I've started to think, kind of take a broader view of grammatical tone and, you know, think about how it relates to other kinds of morphology that might be more familiar, and how I can then share that with the students and what that can teach us about morphology. So these are sort of my preliminary thoughts today. I have a lot of sort of questions and comparisons that I'm making, and I'll be very interested to hear from anybody in the audience your thoughts, your ideas, other possible comparisons that I'm missing. So as an introduction, the study of tone has been dominated by the study of lexical tones, so the use of pitch to distinguish between lexical items, you know, with classic examples coming from Chinese dialects like Mandarin, ma, and ma, all meaning something different, changing the lexical item. Similarly, in African languages like Igbo, aqua means cry, aqua, bed, aqua, cloth, aqua, egg. So the use of pitch in both of these cases just to distinguish one word from another. However, I would say that the majority of tone languages probably show some kind of grammatical tone, whether that be morphological tone, tone that's conditioned by syntactic context, and other kinds of grammatical tone that I'll be talking about today. Despite the prevalence of grammatical tone, I would say that it still remains sort of understudied. It's treated often as exotic, this sort of exotic beast, if it's even treated at all by people. And so one of the things I've been trying to figure out is sort of, you know, why despite its prevalence are people not, you know, kind of paying as much attention to it as I think people should. So I ran this study, this survey a couple years ago to try to get into what people's attitudes were towards tone and their experience with it. And the surprising thing is most people, I mean, basically everybody said tone was really important for phonology. Most people still said that tone was really important for morphology, but teaching practices don't actually reflect that. So I asked about whether teachers would study tone or tone rules or cover them in a phonology class and a morphology class. So the black bars are phonology. And we can see that, you know, most people are covering tone in a phonology class, but most people are not in a morphology class. So a good portion say they never talk about tone in morphology. And things get even more stark when we think about, when we ask the question of whether students are ever assigned a problem set for tonal phonology or morphology. So the majority of people never assign morphology a grammatical tone problem set. So that seems to me to suggest that many linguists may avoid grammatical tone because we've had inadequate training to analyze it. We're never really taught about it. We never have a chance to practice analyzing it in a class. And so then when it comes to doing our own research, we don't really deal with it either. You know, maybe the fact that it's not treated in morphology classes leads to this feeling that it isn't really morphology. Maybe it's just some sort of weird phonology that went astray. Otherwise, I would have seen it in class, right? And so then the cycle kind of continues. Those that do work on grammatical tone, myself included in this boat, I feel like we have a tendency to talk about grammatical tone as this category. You know, what is grammatical tone? How do we analyze grammatical tone as if it's sort of a monolith? Today's talk is aimed at two sort of things, breaking down a couple of these notions. The first is I want to break down the notion that grammatical tone is exotic. It's not. It's quite common, and it does things that we see other kinds of morphology do. And the other you know, sort of barrier to entry or perhaps a false notion is that grammatical tone is monolithic. It's also not. There's a lot of variety in what grammatical tone does and how we potentially should treat it. So I'm going to be giving a kind of overview of 4 different kinds of grammatical tone, just kind of taking an a-theoretical look at these kinds. It's in a way a typology of grammatical tone in the spirit of Nick Roll's work on his dissertation, but I'm not aiming to draw any theoretical conclusions about these 4 kinds. They're kind of surface level categories. And I'm seeking in particular segmental parallels where they exist. And the reason I'm doing this is that it may allow us to determine the best analyses for grammatical tone, different kinds of grammatical tone, or looked at another way, prevent us from reinventing the wheel if there are already tools in the toolkit to deal with these kinds of phenomena. But also to discover the limits of the parallels. So are there certain kinds of grammatical tone that lack a segmental parallel, and why? So ultimately, you know, kind of an overarching question is, you know, is grammatical tone unique in its scope or its diversity? And I'd suggest that the answer is yes, but not overwhelmingly so. So it's a little bit unique, but it's not an entirely different animal. So a roadmap of where we're going. The 4 kinds of grammatical tone I'm going to talk about are first concatenative tonal affixes, then non-concatenative tonal affixes question mark, because this is a little bit of a matter of analysis. Tone changes with affixation that come together, and finally phrasal grammatical tone, and then I'll end with just a very brief discussion. So first, tonal affixes, concatenative tonal affixes. So affixation, of course, is kind of the simplest kind of morphology. It's what we teach in Ling 1 or Ling 101. You add some chunk of material, and that chunk of material means something, and that's a morpheme, right? A chunk of material that means something. So in English, we've got you know, a root like cat, and then you add this chunk, and now that means the plural, and you have cats. In Japanese, you have a root like tabe, you add ta to the end, that means past, you get tabeta. Simple. Easy morphology. It's what everybody is familiar with, right? There are also tonal morphemes that are concatenative in this way. So in this case, we'd be talking about a chunk of suprasegmental or tonal material that means something. In other words, a tonal morpheme. So associative constructions are one place that we can find this. So in Bini, the associative marker is simply a high tone. You add it between 2 nouns. It concatenates with the tones that are around it, and it marks possession. So owe and osa, you add this high tone between them, you get owe osa, and it means chimpanzee's leg. High tone means associative. Similarly, in Bambara, Mande language of Mali, the definite is marked tonally with a tonal affix, we could call it. But a low tone, it means definite. And once again, it concatenates with the tones of the root. So wari plus low gives us wari, and it means the money. Musu plus low gives us musu, and it means the woman. We can find this tone and its meaning, and it concatenates. So tonal morphemes like this are also typically referred to as floating tones, since they're not associated with segmental material. But of course, we need to be careful in that not all floating tones are tonal morphemes. These are not interchangeable terms. There are plenty of languages where certain lexical items carry a floating tone just as part of their melody. So this is some data from Poko, a language in Papua New Guinea I did fieldwork on last year. The third singular masculine kak carries a high tone after it. that's realized on the next word, but the first singular does not. Otherwise, they're tonally identical. And the floating high doesn't mean anything. It's simply part of the word his, right? So this is a floating tone, but not a tonal morpheme. In terms of analysis, tonal affixes are just clearly morphology. I don't think anybody would argue that they're anything but morphology. It might be possible to analyze them as a cophonology, but I don't think there's any real incentive to, right? So we could say, there's a cophonology for Bambara, and the constraint ranking is such that all definite nouns end in low. Possible analysis, but no one, I think, would probably reasonably argue that there's a cophonology for the English plural such that all plural nouns end in Z. Most people just simply think of Z as being an affix unto itself, and I think we could say the same thing for the definite low tone, right? It's an entity unto itself. Things get a little bit more complicated when we start dealing with non-concatenative tonal affixes, ? So here's an example from Kalabari Ijo, which is a language spoken in Nigeria. Once again, we can identify a relationship between tone and meaning. So low-high in Kalabari Ijo means intransitive, but unlike what we saw before, the tone doesn't concatenate. It actually just replaces the lexical melody of the root. So kan becomes kan, be torn, a low tone becomes kon, a high tone becomes anya, a high downstep high becomes saki. It doesn't matter what tone you put in, you get low-high on the outside, so it doesn't concatenate. So we could say something like, maybe in Kalabari Ijo, these are tonal affixes, but tonal affixes in Kalabari Ijo don't concatenate, they just replace. The problem is that in the very same language, you find tonal morphemes that do concatenate. So the imperative in Kalabari Ijo is marked by high-low, and in this case, you actually do get concatenation with the root's tone. So a high-toned root like so becomes high-low so, but a low-toned root like saw becomes saw, low-high-low, and you get concatenation. So it isn't some sort of parameter that the language sets. There has to be something different, representationally about these two kinds of tone. So we could turn to segmental parallels. Is there anything similar outside of the world of tone that could give us a foothold, right? And the first thing that came to mind for me when I was thinking about this was root and pattern morphology. This is familiar from Semitic languages, that we can identify that there are certain patterns or vowels or shapes that mean something, but that they don't concatenate. They overlay the whole root. So here's some here's some data from Sinaya, which is a Neo-Aramaic language I did fieldwork on in grad school. And the imperfective always consistently has this pattern of a long a vowel in between the first two consonants, so kas, rakt, mach, and the perfective always has a long a vowel in between the second two consonants, so kseo, reked, mche. So maybe this is similar to what we just saw, but root and pattern morphology, I think, differs from what we see in Kalabari Ijo in the sense that these aren't replacing anything per se. In other words, there doesn't seem to be a lexical contrast in the roots that's being, overwritten by these vowels. It's just predictably in certain environments, you're always going to get this, and in other environments, you're always going to get that. So it's a little bit different from the Kalabari Ijo case. We can find parallels for this tonally, I think. An example might be Somali, where gender is marked by tone. And masculine consistently has penultimate high, and feminine consistently has final high. So inan with penultimate high means boy, and inan with final high means girl. And the Somali roots have often been analyzed as not having any underlying tone. So it's not that it's replacing anything, it's more like the root and pattern sense where you've got this tonal melody and you consistently kind of feed these roots in, and depending on the context, they'll get one or the other. So we might get root and pattern tone, but it's not what we saw in Kalabari Ijo. So the question is there something segmental like Kalabari Ijo? Do we find replacive segmental morphology? And I've racked my brain. This is the best I could come up with. And if you have better examples, I'd be very interested to hear them. But this is an example from Bade, which is a Chadic language. And these are just a little tiny bit of data that I could find in Russ Shu's Morphology 105 class notes. And what we can see is it looks like ah marks the intransitive, but specifically it's a replacive ah on the middle syllable of longer words. So it can replace a schwa, so abjamu can become abjamu, and it can replace an e vowel, so almiyu can become almayu. So this might be a replacive pattern, but I could also see looking at this data and thinking, well, I mean, this could just be a schwa before palatal glide, so maybe it's not really an E, maybe once again, it's something closer to root and pattern. I mean, this is Afro-Asiatic after all. So questionably replacive. So in terms of analyzing these non-concatenative affixes, which I'll call them, you know, we can ask where do they belong in the grammar? Well, they're still clearly morphology. They're a pairing of form and meaning, but how we go about analyzing them, I see a lot more possibilities than with concatenative affixes, which offer kind of a clearer path forward. So, you know, we could think about it in terms of template morphology. You know, this is sort of a framework that came up for Semitic after the development of autosegmental representations, where, you know, you've got these different tiers. You could say there's a root tier in Arabic, and that's KTB, the consonants, and then there's the skeletal tier, and CVC means cause to X, and then there's a vowel tier, and A means active, and you put those together and you get katab. You know, so you could analyze that similarly for these tone patterns that are non-concatenative, that there's a tonal tier that means something. There have been affixal treatments of root and pattern morphology. So Usishkin in 2005 treats Hebrew root and pattern morphology as affixation. And it's just the regular morphophonological grammar that then ends up interleaving those vowels as opposed to concatenating them using tools like output-to-output correspondence, minimality, and maximality, meaning that Hebrew words want to be 2 syllables long, basically. So gadal and ie, the best you can do with that while respecting this 2-syllable target is gidel. Right, realizing the vowels interleaved. So this approach seems to work pretty well for Hebrew, but Arabic, from my reading of it, has a lot more variation in the patterns, and I'm not sure that this affixation approach would work quite as well. In Nick Roll's work, he treats both kinds of tone, like the Kalabari replacive low-high and then the concatenative high-low. He treats them both as tonal affixes. But he says that their behavior is a question of dominance. So the low-high is a dominant affix, the high-low is a non-dominant affix, and their different effects on the root are captured by cophonologies. Basically, they come with different constraint rankings, one of which ends up overwriting the root and the other of which ends up concatenating. And so in his view, concatenative or floating tones and replacive tones are 2 ends of a spectrum or a cline, and they can be accounted for in the same framework. So that's certainly an analytical possibility as well. Moving on to add a little layer of complication, tone changes with affixation. So this is a very common pattern that grammatical tone is actually accompanied by segmental affixation. So they don't occur on their own. And this is a pattern that Roll calls auxiliary prosodic exponents. So it's not multiple exponents in the sense that the affix and the tone both mean the morphosyntactic feature, but rather that the tone kind of comes along and helps out on the exponents of the morphosyntactic feature. So an example comes from Hausa, and Hausa has a number of examples, but the ventive is one. The ventive is marked by the suffix, which is a long O vowel, and in addition to a high tone that then replaces the tone of the root. So fita, a low-high verb, becomes fito with all high tone and the segmental affix. So you kind of get, they're a package deal, you get both. Turning to Japanese and some of Shigeto's work, we can find equivalents in Japanese pitch accent, which is arguably just a kind of tone. For example, we find pre-accenting suffixes like ke, the head of the family. So in this case, it doesn't matter what name and the pitch accent of that name that you put before it, the suffix k will always come along with a pitch accent that comes right immediately before it. So ono will turn into onoke, Yoshida into Yoshidake, Ura into Urake, and Nishimura into Nishimurake. So once again, there's no need, quote unquote, for that pre-accent, right? It's not contributing any meaning, but it always just comes along with K. So can we find segmental parallels for this? Once again, our friends in Semitic offer us parallels. So Hebrew, for instance, has certain patterns, like the transitive or causative, which are always accompanied by a prefix. So the pattern is CCEC, but it always has a he prefix. So gadal to higdil, pachad to hifchid, katav to hichtiv, with some spirantization as well. So this would be another case where, you know, you've got the root and pattern morphology, but it's always coupled with an affix. There are cases, though, that are a little bit harder than, you know, simply saying, all right, great, we've got an affix and we've got a tone, or we've got an affix and we've got a root and pattern. Sometimes it gets harder to deal with. And I'll give you an example from Tomaso. So at first glance, Tomaso looks like kind of maybe what we saw for Hausa, in that there are certain affixes, suffixes in this case, that seem like they come along with a tone pattern. So I've given you a high-toned verb here, kana, and a low-high verb, jobo. And depending on the inflection of the verb, they take different affixes and tone patterns. So it looks like the imperfective comes with high-low, so you get kanade and jobode. So it always comes with de and high-low. The perfective seems to come with this front vowel suffix, e or e, depending on the vowel harmony, and a low tone, so kani and jobe. And similarly for the negative perfective, it comes with a li suffix and a low tone, so kanali, joboli. Looks kind of like the ventive. We've got a suffix, we've got some tone. The problem is that they kind of decouple. We can't really say that the imperfective is just marked with de and a high-low pattern, because we find different patterns in main clauses and relative clauses. So the suffixes remain consistent in both main clauses and relative clauses, but the tones then decouple. So in a main clause, you know, that's what I showed you before, kanade, jobode. But in a relative clause, there is no overlay. For the perfective, in a main clause, there's a low overlay. In the relative clause, there's a high-low overlay. So it's not that there's just kind of one lexical item for these affixes and they come with tone patterns. They seem to be combining, playing different roles, either that or you've got a proliferation of these package deals, one for main clause and one for relative clause in the lexicon. So a parallel to the Tomaso case that I could suggest would be the German plural umlaut. So plural in German is marked by the suffixes or and or umlaut. So they don't always come together. So we find cases like am in the singular and alme in the plural with no umlaut, just the suffix we find cases like Vater and Väter, where it's only umlaut with no affix. We find cases where they come together, like Hals and Hälse. Bild and Bilder, it's already a front vowel, so we can't really tell. Wurm and Würme for worms. So again, you can't say that it's plus umlaut means plural. They kind of each maybe or might. There are some things that are consistent, like apparently with the R always will come with umlaut if it can, but the suffix and umlaut on its own can also kind of show up together. So that might be sort of similar to the Tomaso case. Okay, so I find these patterns really interesting, these affixation plus tone, because it raises a question of whether the tone patterns that we see, the grammatical tone patterns that we see, belong to the affix or whether they belong to the stem. So, you know, just from a purely atheoretical standpoint, we can say that we see tone changes and affixation occurring together. So there's this link between what's happening on the stem and what's happening on the affix. But there's a question of whether it's the affix kind of contributing something to the stem, whether that's a prefix or a suffix, or whether it's that, you know, the affix selects a particular kind of stem, like those changes are actually part of the stem, a stem allomorph, let's say, and the affix selects it, right? We've got kind of a choice of where we want to put it. And if we think of these being allomorphs of the stem, like there's high-low allomorphs of a verb stem in Tomaso, and there's low allomorphs of a verb stem in Tomaso, then it starts to look sort of like, you know, the inflection classes and all of these different stems that you get, for example, in the Romance languages. So in French, different inflectional categories select different stems. Just to give one example, with the verb boire, to drink, You find a stem buve, which shows up in the imperfect, je buvais. You find a stem boive, which shows up in the present, but only when the subject is plural, so nous boivons. You find the stem bois, which shows up in the present when it's singular, so je bois, and also in the future, regardless of person. And then you find a stem bu in the past participle. So, you know, like the Tomaso case, you can't, you know, there's no really good one-to-one correspondence between any of these stems and any inflectional category. Rather, they kind of cross-cut in a non-systematic sort of way. And so, you know, something to account for these, something like paradigm function morphology or what have you, could offer ways forward to think about something like the Tomaso inflectional tone. And in fact, we probably would need an approach sort of like that for some of these wilder systems that we find in Odomangaean, for instance, where you get different tone patterns and different segmental patterns depending on the stem and then where they're used. So just to give one example from Chichimek, we have this verb stem, which is E in at least some forms, and it does, this low tone version shows up in some places, but we also find a high tone version in the potential, but not if it's second singular or third plural. If it's third plural, we always find it with an R. If it's second singular, we always find it with a T instead of a glottal stop, but not if it's present, right? So we find these kind of patchwork tone, grammatical tone, and segmental changes happening throughout the paradigm, and it looks like there are some patterns in ways that these are connected to affixes that might mark, for instance, person, but not in a one-to-one fashion. So these are the sorts of parallels that we might want to draw when we're thinking about our ways to analyze this. Okay, so where does this kind of tone belong, right? This auxiliary prosodic exponents, to use Roll's term for it, it has multiple analytical possibilities depending on how you want to think about it. If you think about it as being part of the affix, it's very clearly morphology. You know, it's part of just the representation of the affix. And so that can be mitigated then or applied using the regular morphophonological grammar or using cophonologies if you need to differentiate. If it's part of the stem, then we can think about it in terms of stem allomorphy. We're starting to get kind of a more lexical approach to this grammatical tone rather than, you know, a sort of clearly morphological, active morphological, let's say. You think about it in terms of a morphomic analysis, to use Aronoff's term for these stems that don't carry necessarily any meaning but are used in certain contexts. You can take a construction morphology approach to them, which is, you know, what I did in my dissertation for some of this tone. I mean, construction morphology is a way of representing cophonologies, but these are just a range of tools that could possibly address these kinds of grammatical tone. All right, I'll leave you with one last kind that's sort of the most far afield of the ones I'll talk about today, and that's phrasal grammatical tone. So in many languages, you find these same kinds of replacive overlays, but happening between words. So, you know, we're moving on from word formation to phrase formation. And so we saw Tomaso verbal inflection, all of these overlays happening with affixes, but in the noun phrase or the DP, you see them happening between words. So some modifiers like a numeral don't do anything tonally. So a word like babe can retain its low-high tone, babe tandu. But adjectives and demonstratives both will trigger a low tone on that noun, so babe como or babe ni. A possessive pronoun will trigger either high or high-low, depending on the length of the word, and a possessive noun will trigger low. So these are the same sorts of tones that we just saw happening at the word level, but now happening at the phrase level. And in fact, it can go beyond that because they can extend across multiple words. So a demonstrative's low tone can cover both that noun and numeral, for instance, which otherwise don't have any tonal interaction. A possessor's low tone can cover a noun and an adjective, so on and so forth. Calabar Ijo is another example of a language that has replacive overlays at both the word level and the phrase level, only they've got even greater variability in these replacive patterns. So high-low, high-low-high, low-high, and low, all from different kinds of categories of modifiers. And you can see in this example here how this neutralizes, again, that lexical tone. So it doesn't matter what the lexical tone is going in. If there's a nominal possessor, it'll come out with a high-low. If there's a pronominal possessor, it'll come out with high-low-high or high downstepped high here. And like in Tomaso, these melodies can map across multiple words in one chunk. So it's not that you get, you know, high-low, 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 and it repeating on all of these words. There's really just one melody, and it maps across multiple words at a time. So what do we do with these? I mean, these are kind of the stickiest in a way, right? You know, one possibility would be to simply say that these words have lexical floating tones associated with them. But from my perspective, this is a little bit redundant. It becomes redundant and misses a broader generalization to say, well, in Tomaso, every adjective has a floating low tone associated with it. Seems like a coincidence. So, you know, it's kind of missing the broader generalization. There are some languages like Urarina, for instance, that you do seem to need to posit that certain words carry certain tones, but the evidence for this comes from the fact that not every word works the same way. So, you know, it's less redundant. So what else could we say? Okay, maybe they're tonal morphemes, right? Maybe we've got a low-toned morpheme, but the problem is they don't seem to mean anything that at least we see a parallel for in the segmental world. Like we could say low-high means determined, but there's not really segmental morphemes out there like an affix that we find that means determined in languages or quantified. All of this is clear from the fact that there's a determiner or a quantifier there. So this is like auxiliary prosodic exponents. You know, it's just kind of coming along with something else, but at the phrasal level. And it's unusual in terms of the fact, like, again, thinking about segmental morphology, it's rare to find a single morpheme that would affect multiple words at a time. You know, so you could think, okay, well, agreement shows up on multiple words, but it's repeated on each word. It's not just a single morpheme. And further, that's something that tends to come from the head and go to its dependents rather than from a modifier going down and affecting the head. So it's sort of a different beast. So the closest segmental parallel that I've been able to come up with is the construct state. Once again, Semitic linguistics, maybe there's some deep connection between Semitic languages and grammatical tone. This is a concept that's often been applied to head marking in possessive constructions. So, you know, genitive case marks the possessor, but this construct state is on the possessed noun. So in Moroccan Arabic, khala means aunt, but it has this construct state, khalt, and that's used when there's a possessor present, whether that's a noun like khalt bint, aunt of the girl, or khalti, my aunt, with a suffix. You also find these construct states in Dinka in a much more elaborate fashion that's getting, I feel, in a way closer to what we've seen from grammatical tone. There are two different kinds of construct states in Dinka, depending on the category of the modifiers. This is looking like Kalabari Ijo or looking like Tomaso. Some you find them with demonstratives or relative clauses. Others you find with adjectives and possessors. So, and a lot of these, going back to these parallels, a lot of these Dinka construct states involve both tonal and segmental changes. So once again, this might be sort of reminiscent of the Chichimet case where you've got different versions of stems with different tone patterns or different segmental changes depending on their context. But in this case, the context is at the phrase level rather than at the word level. So some similarities and differences between construct states and the phrasal grammatical tone. The similarities are that you see these changes in stem form. They're triggered by morphosyntactic context, but they don't really seem to mean anything in the traditional morphological sense. However, they differ in the sense that construct states tend to be much more idiosyncratic, at least in Dinka. You know, certain words will have this kind of tone change or this kind of segmental change, and then another stem will have something entirely different. Whereas in both Kalabari Ijo and in Tomaso, it's entirely consistent. It's always low or it's always high-low. And further, the construct state seems to only affect a single word, which is the stem, rather than taking these larger phrasal domains, like the phrasal grammatical tone. So what do we do? What do we do with phrasal grammatical tone? Where does it belong? We could see it as part of the stem again, and then just list these lexical allomorphs that, you know, nouns have a low toned form, a lexically toned form, a high-low toned form, and they get inserted in particular contexts. So this would be something like going back to Bruce Hayes's precompiled phrasal phonology, that there are just certain frames in the lexicon that select different stem allomorphs. In my dissertation, I took the construction morphology approach, but at the phrasal level, that, you know, there are these sort of abstract constructions as part of the lexicon that will specify that in a syntactic configuration like a possessor and a noun, you get this phonological effect, which is high-low. And once again, this is sort of a way of representing co-phonologies, but just within the construction as opposed to through the re-ranking of constraints. So co-phonologies would be another way to do it. And in fact, this is what Roll does in his dissertation. Okay, so I've raised a lot of possibilities, as I said, lots of possibilities, not a lot of answers, because I don't think it's my job here to tell you what to think. What it is my job to say right now is that grammatical tone is not all the same. It's a very diverse set of phenomenon. Some of it is meaningful, some of it's not, some of it's affixal, some of it seems to be more tightly related to the stem, some of it occurs at the word level, some of it at the phrasal level, some of it is replacive, some of it concatenates. So we have a lot of different things going on when we say grammatical tone. There's a lot included under that umbrella. But generally, grammatical tone is not actually that overly exotic. In most cases, the toolkit that we have from more familiar morphology, even if it's, you know, root and pattern morphology or Semitic morphology, which is, you know, the more exotic of the segmental kinds, it's still a similar toolkit that could help us address it and move forward with it. Tonal affixes, they fit great into item and arrangement models, including things like distributed morphology. They'd make a great vocabulary item. Just insert your low tone that means definite and you're good to go. Non-affixal tone, or, you know, replacive tone or dominant tone could be accounted for using co-phonologies or construction morphology, other realizational approaches to morphology. So not, you know, totally out of this world, doesn't require something totally different. That being said, there are some differences that I think are important to pay attention to. So replacive tone seems to be quite common, but replacive segmental processes less so. So typically some features of the segments are retained, right? So you think about, you know, umlaut, some features of the vowel are retained, or vowel harmony, some features of the vowel are retained. In consonant mutation, some features of the consonants are retained. It's not totally replacive. Phrase level or multi-word effects are much more common for tone than for segmental stuff. But in my view, all of these differences probably have more to do with diachrony than anything inherent to the morphological component. If you think about the pathways of sound change that lead to morphologization of tone or of segmental things, there's not so many pathways that are going to lead you to replace every second consonant with K, whereas you can imagine, you know, interpreting a high tone as always coming in and replacing the tone of the stem. So this may not be something that we need to do sort of brute force with our morphological models per se. Okay, so the value of doing this kind of comparison is that it avoids us duplicating theories that can account for similar patterns. And I think, you know, for me in putting this together, it also helped me recognize the scalar nature of these phenomena, for some of them in a way that I hadn't quite appreciated before. So thinking about like the stem tone changes, for instance, you know, you find a scale going from these purely tonal and totally consistent stem allomorphs, something like, you know, the low toned nouns in tomoso before adjectives, totally consistent. And then you get these tonal and segmental stem allomorphs with maybe some consistency to them, like dinka could be an example. It looks kind of idiosyncratic, but there are patterns that emerge, you know, where construct states share particular features, to, you know, the Otomangaean case where you've got wildly idiosyncratic stem allomorphs. And because of this scalar nature, you don't really want to draw a firm line and say, okay, what Otomangaean's doing is totally different from what Tomoso is doing, because it's a spectrum. So it's important for that, and I hope that in comparing these things to segmental morphology, you know, we all sort of feel more empowered to address grammatical tone, that it's not something so wildly different that you need to be thinking about in a totally different way. So finally, should there be a unified account of grammatical tone? Is grammatical tone a thing that we should account for in some particular way? Roll's dissertation sort of offers a possibility for this, using a combination of distributed morphology and co-phonologies to account for a whole range of different tone patterns. And it seems to work, but I think the bigger question is, we can ask this about grammatical tone, but the bigger question is, should there be a unified account of morphology in general? Grammatical tone is extremely diverse as any kind of morphology, where you get everything from affixation to base modification, stem allomorphy, word and phrase level. So the question is, what does the human morphological component look like? Is there one tool that does it all for humans, or do we have a range of tools at our disposal when we're learning and replicating these patterns that we hear in our data? So I will leave that as a question for the morphologists out there to ponder the big questions of grammar. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please send a direct message to Seunghun Lee. That would be good. We have one question already. So let's have Kenan ask the question. So Kenan from UCLA.
Oh, okay, we're back. Hi, thanks for this really, really cool talk. I was curious whether whether you had considered or knew of any literature doing any kind of morphological priming studies to look at what's actually in the lexicon. Because I mean, one way that you've been taking this is sort of laying out all the analytical possibilities, laying out all of the implications that has for different theories, but kind of another way to go about this is to kind of say, well, I mean, to the degree we know what priming means at all, which is not total, we say, well, what primes what? Is a morphologically derived high tone, does that prime a underlying surface true high tone, or a same category, phonetically differently realized status, that kind of thing. Recent work by Dave Embeck and Afa Kramers out of UPenn are looking at this with English inflectional morphology and finding some cool results.
Oh, cool.
I'm sorry, please, I'll stop.
No, that's great. Thank you for that suggestion. I am not sure about work that's been doing this for grammatical tone per se. The one thing that comes to mind, and of course I don't remember any details or conclusions or anything about it right now, would be the studies that look at, I'm pretty sure there are priming studies for Sundhi in like Taiwanese, for instance, these cases, and I was going to put some slides in here, but I was totally out of time, about those being kind of the extreme. Like some of these Sundhi systems are like, people argue about whether they belong in phonology or morphology, because they really feel like they have a foot in each camp. And so I think there've been some priming studies with Sundhi tones that might be interesting to look at, but those are further along the scale towards phonology, which doesn't mean that it's not pertinent, but that it's maybe less in line with what Embeck and Kramer are looking at for English. It'd be super cool to look at those kinds of studies if they did exist.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Next question is from Shigeto Kawahara.
Actually, I have two comments, but one of them, we have other experts, so I'll just raise it and let other people speak. The first one is when you started talking about grammatical tones, one thing that came to my mind was deletion of lexical accent in Japanese. That can happen in various environments, right? And I didn't know how to make sense of that, because it's not really a morpheme, it's deletion of an accent, right? But when you made a comparison between these tonal events and non-concatenative morphology, there are some cases in which you delete a vowel to make a plural. So that kind of...
Yeah, definitely. I didn't include I kind of specifically chose the pre-accenting things because they were simpler and more clearly grammatical tone. But yeah, the subtractive accent, so two things. I mean, one, you can say, yeah, there are segmental parallels. There's subtractive morphology, as rare as it may be, that does exist. And so again, it's not just tone that takes something away. We also see it in the segmental world. And the other thing would be that I think, some of these other tone patterns could one could argue maybe they are also subtractive. Like in some languages where low is the default, you could say, okay, there's a low overlay, or it's subtractive tone, and then you insert low, right? I don't think that's the case for Tomaso. You do get a distinction between default, or there are toneless syllables, and then there are low tone syllables, but there are probably systems that could be analyzed that way.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And the other comment could be more challenging. So the another example that I was thinking is a Fukuoka Japanese, where in the WH sentence, you put a high tone on the WH marker, and that high tone extends and replaces all the lexical tones up until the complementizer, which determines the scope of that WH. So that's a pretty wild thing. I don't think that something of that kind never happens in segmental phonology, right?
Totally,
Yeah,
absolutely. I agree. That's an awesome case. And it's like these other phrasal grammatical tone cases where it's just like, we don't really see segmental morphology doing that exactly, just extending across these huge phrases. But, again, we can ask, is that because it's totally unthinkable that, there would be such a process, or is it that it would never arise diachronically? So that's really cool. I'm gonna write you about, like, if you've got a—
Oh, sure, yeah, I can give you some references. And Toshio Matsura here is an expert. I don't know if he's comfortable speaking in English, but yeah. Oh, no, yep.
Okay, thank you. Next is Haruo Kubozono from Ninja.
Hello, thank you very much for your great talk. I was impressed by the range of things that tones can do, but I was wondering if there's anything that tones cannot do, while syntax and ordinary morphology can do.
That's a very good question. I think because I've been in the camp of people who think a lot about grammatical tone, right? I've thought more about the opposite direction, like what can tone do, and then other things can't. I'd certainly open this question up to the rest of the audience if you can think of things that segmental morphology does that tone doesn't. My feeling is, and kind of echoing Larry Hyman here, is like, tone can do everything regular phonology and morphology can do, and more, right? So I would be surprised if there were something segmental that you don't see tone doing. I think it has a wider scope of things, but I guess, and I love to quote that Larry Hyman quote. I echo it in lots of papers, but at the same time, when I was putting this talk together, I was thinking there's a danger in hammering that line too hard, in the sense that then we start to think about tone as being really, really this radically different thing, and focusing on just the little bit that's different rather than the bulk that's actually the same. And I think that can lead then to trying to reinvent the wheel or thinking about things. And again, I'm putting myself very firmly in this camp of people who've been doing this. So this is my own sort of evolution of thinking in this talk.
And I have a comment on what you said about Japanese, the Japanese example, the ending ke, meaning family. I think that's that accentual phenomenon is not specific to that particular morpheme. It's a general compound effect. Even if whatever you add to a stem, a monomoraic or bimoraic elements, then you have exactly the same thing, the same accentual phenomena. Say, jin, meaning people. So America jin, France jin, whatever you add at the beginning, every compound, every phrase or word has the same accentual pattern. And of course, the first element is de-accented if it is lexically accented. But that's a general thing in compounds. Even in English, blackboard, pair, you have deletion or reduction of the accent of the second stress of the second element. And that's a very general compound effect.
Okay, that's a good point to keep in mind. I guess, yeah. You know, I thought of it as potentially different, but I just need to do more reading on it than just plain deaccenting, because there are also the deaccenting morphemes, right? I mean, both the dominant ones, like poi is an example of this, right? Where it carries its own accent, you know, kodomo poi, and it, you know, deletes the accent completely of whatever precedes it. But then there are the things like ke that then add an accent. So, you know, there is a kind of wide range of what the affixes do in Japanese. So it's not like 100% consistent, but yes, point well taken that it's not totally bound up in that affix.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The last question is from Katie, not Kate, sorry. Katie.
That was great, Laura, so much. And I was wondering whether you could comment at all on why you think that tone is sort of special in this way. Why you think that it may be able to behave in these ways that segments can't, if it is the case that tone indeed can do everything segments can and more.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have very well-formed thoughts about it. You know, I mean, we do see, you know, even in like let's just say talk about, you know, lexical tone or just purely phonological tone, you know, ignoring grammatical tone altogether, you know, we see it kind of slide around, you know, because of its super segmental nature, as opposed to, you know, using the larynx as opposed to using the articulators. You know, you get peak delay, and so it starts to shift, and then it can be reinterpreted as having shifted over. And so, you know, I guess if you do that for enough generations, it can end up in some kind of wildly different place than where it was supposed to begin. Whereas the co-articulatory effects on segments tend to be more local. You know, you're not going to have your like velar stop like start to shift like 4 segments over, right, through consonants and vowels. But I mean, you do see some stuff moving. Like, I mean, I think nasality is you know, more segmental effect that has a bit more independence like tone. But I don't totally know. It's not totally my domain. Thinking about kind of how in sound change we end up with these crazy systems. Like, I've thought about how the phrasal grammatical tone things could arise from regular phrasal phonology, you know, things like deaccentuation, like, right, like Haruo was just saying that, you know, you could kind of think about a noun and an adjective coming together and the noun deaccenting in a way, and then over time this comes to be interpreted as a low tone overlay rather than being you know, just a difference in prominence, you know, and then things changing and it becoming less about the prosodic phrasing and more about the you know, the adjective itself. So those are just some kind of sketchy thoughts. I don't have anything particularly insightful, I don't think, to say about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We will continue the discussion a little bit more after the formal session is over. So if you have any question and discussion, please stay a little bit longer. Thank you again to Laura. Thank you for the great talk. And before formally ending the session, I want to thank the assistant Migiwa and also, of course, Shigeto, who co-hosted the event. And this event was supported by the Institute of Cultural and Linguistic Studies at Keio University and the Linguistic Lab at International Christian University. The next part of season 2 of the Keio ICU Linguistic Colloquium will be held on October 16. Please note the time of that event will be different from today's, because our speakers will join us from Europe. And on October 16, Timo Röttger from University of Osnabrück and Adam Chong from Queen Mary University of London will share their research. The talks will begin 5 p.m. from 5 p.m. Japan Standard Time on that day. Also, we are excited to announce the panel speaker of this series of season 2. Donka Steriade from MIT will share her work on October 30th. That's a Saturday instead of a Friday. Saturday morning Japan time. And you will find more information on the event website. So thank you all again who participated in today's colloquium, and also thanks to 2 speakers who share their exciting research, and we hope to see you on October 16th. The recording will now start. Yeah.